The metal wheels had been singing their monotonous song for what felt like forever when Greta first noticed something wrong with the darkness outside. She pressed her face against the cold glass of the train window, her breath creating small circles of fog that obscured and then revealed what her mind struggled to accept. Light. Not the weak, flickering kind she'd grown accustomed to, not candles or oil lamps or the occasional working streetlight, but brilliant, steady illumination that stretched across the Louisiana landscape like someone had captured pieces of the sun and hung them at regular intervals along the horizon. This was the night of December 12, 1944, and the three German women crammed into that railway car were about to step into a reality that would shatter everything they thought they understood about the world. Liesl spoke first, her voice carrying that edge of suspicion she wielded like a weapon against uncertainty. "They're trying to trick us," she said, though even she didn't sound convinced. "It's some kind of display, temporary lights set up to make us think they have resources they don't actually possess." But the lights kept coming, mile after mile, and the excuse grew thinner with each passing moment. Greta said nothing, just watched those impossible electric lights multiply until they seemed to outnumber the stars themselves. Her stomach had been twisted in knots since they'd boarded this train in New York, wondering what fresh horrors awaited them at their destination. The propaganda she'd consumed for years had painted Americans as desperate, struggling, barely holding their crumbling society together. Yet here was evidence that someone had been lying, and the implications of that deception made her feel sick in ways that had nothing to do with the train's motion. The locomotive began its final approach with a screech of brakes that set her teeth on edge. Greta gripped the wooden bench beneath her, knuckles white, preparing herself for whatever came next. She'd been a medic with a field unit, had seen men die in ways that still haunted her sleep, had been captured during a bombing raid that left her with cracked ribs and the certainty that survival meant enduring whatever punishment victors chose to inflict on the defeated. She expected cruelty. She expected deprivation. She expected Americans to treat her the way she'd been taught enemies should be treated. The door to their car slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and the flood of light that poured in was so intense that all three women recoiled as if physically struck. Greta threw her arm across her face, squinting against the glare, convinced for a wild moment that this was some new form of torture. But as her eyes adjusted, what she saw through the gaps between her fingers made no sense at all. The platform was clean, not just relatively clean or acceptably maintained, but spotless in a way that seemed almost obscene. The concrete gleamed under those blazing floodlights, and she could see American soldiers moving with casual efficiency, their uniforms pressed and complete, their faces showing none of the gaunt desperation she'd been led to expect. A woman stepped into view, backlit by the lights so that Greta could only make out her silhouette at first. When she spoke, her German was careful but comprehensible, each word pronounced with the kind of deliberate care that suggested real effort had been made to communicate properly. "Welcome to Camp Ruston," the shadow said, and as Greta's vision cleared, she could finally see the speaker's face. An American officer, tall and composed, with eyes that held something Greta couldn't quite identify. Not hatred, which would have made sense, not even the cold indifference of duty, something that looked disturbingly close to compassion. "My name is Captain Reynolds," the woman continued, "and I know you've had a long journey. We have coffee waiting, hot coffee, and then we'll get you settled in your quarters." Coffee. The word hit Greta like a physical blow. Not the chicory substitute they'd been choking down for months, but actual coffee, the scent of which was already drifting through the open door and making her mouth water despite her determination to resist any kindness from her captors. She wanted to refuse on principle, to maintain the dignity of defiance, but her hands betrayed her when a young American soldier offered her a steaming cup. She took it, hating the weakness even as her fingers wrapped around the warmth, and when she raised it to her lips, the taste made her close her eyes against unexpected tears. This was better coffee than she'd had in officers' quarters, richer and smoother than anything available to civilians in the last year of rationing. How could a nation supposedly on the brink of collapse serve such luxuries to prisoners? Anna made a small sound beside her, something between a gasp and a sob, and Greta turned to see the older woman accepting help down from the train car with a gentleness that seemed entirely wrong for the situation. The American soldier supporting her elbow was young, maybe 20, with freckles across his nose and a smile that reached his eyes. He guided Anna across the platform as if she were a respected aunt rather than an enemy combatant, and the cognitive dissonance of it made Greta's head spin. Even Liesel, who'd spent the entire journey muttering about American propaganda and psychological warfare, accepted her coffee with hands that shook slightly, her usual rigid certainty showing its first cracks. Captain Reynolds gestured toward a row of low buildings in the distance, their windows glowing with more of that impossible electric light. "Those are your barracks," she explained, her tone conversational rather than commanding. "Each of you will have your own bed with clean linens, storage for personal belongings, and access to washing facilities. Dinner service begins at 1800 hours, and tomorrow we'll conduct medical examinations to ensure everyone's health needs are being met." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "I understand this must be disorienting. You've been through a great deal. But I want you to know that while you're in our custody, you'll be treated with the respect due to any person under our care." Greta felt something crack inside her chest, some carefully maintained wall she'd built to protect herself from hope. She wanted to scream at this woman, to demand why Americans were being kind when kindness made everything so much harder, when cruelty would have been easier to process and resist. Instead, she just stood there on that gleaming platform, holding her coffee and feeling her entire understanding of reality begin to crumble like poorly mixed concrete. The walk to the barracks felt surreal, each step taking her deeper into enemy territory that looked nothing like enemy territory should look. The paths were well maintained, bordered by grass that someone clearly tended with care. Other prisoners moved in small groups, their postures relaxed rather than hunched in fear or defiance. An American guard nodded respectfully as they passed, calling out a greeting in broken German that was more friendly than threatening. Everything about this place contradicted the narratives Greta had built her worldview around, and the contradiction was more terrifying than any threat could have been. When Captain Reynolds opened the door to their assigned barracks, Greta stopped walking entirely. The space before her looked like something from a fever dream, too perfect to be real. Individual cots lined the walls, each made up with white sheets that appeared freshly laundered, the kind of crisp cleanliness she associated with hospitals rather than prisons. Electric heaters hummed in the corners, already warming the December air, and overhead lights cast steady illumination that didn't flicker or smoke or require constant adjustment. The floor had been swept and mopped recently enough that she could still smell the faint scent of soap, and through the windows she could see more of those impossible lights stretching into the Louisiana night. "This isn't possible," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, too small and frightened for someone who'd survived combat and capture and the collapse of everything familiar. Captain Reynolds turned toward her with that same inexplicable expression, something that looked like understanding mixed with sadness. "I know it seems overwhelming," the American officer said quietly, "but this is real, and it's yours for the duration of your stay." She handed Greta a thick packet of papers, the pages crisp and new. "These documents explain our procedures, meal schedules, medical services, and camp regulations. Everything has been translated into German. If you have questions or concerns, Sergeant Kowalski is fluent in your language and available to help. Medical services." The phrase made Greta's throat tighten. During her last months with the field unit, she'd watched soldiers die from wounds that basic medical care could have prevented. They'd run out of antibiotics in early autumn, had been reusing bandages until they fell apart, had performed surgeries with instruments sterilized over open flames because there was no other option. Men had died from infections that any competent doctor could have cured with the right supplies, and she'd held their hands as they slipped away, promising them deaths that meant something when she knew deep in her bones, that they were dying from entirely preventable causes. "What kind of medical services do you have here?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Captain Reynolds consulted a clipboard as if checking off a routine inventory rather than describing resources that would have seemed like miracles to Greta's former unit. "We have a fully equipped hospital wing with X-ray capability, a surgical suite, a well-stocked pharmacy, and 3 doctors on staff. Dr. Mitchell is our primary care physician, and he's excellent. You'll meet him during tomorrow's examination." She said it so casually, as if X-ray machines and surgical suites and pharmacies were normal things to have available for prisoners of war, as unremarkable as beds and coffee and electric lights. Greta's knees nearly gave out. In her entire medical career, she'd seen exactly 1 X-ray machine, and it had been broken for months before anyone with the authority to fix it could be located. She'd dreamed of having access to such equipment, had imagined how many diagnoses could be made earlier and more accurately, how many lives could be saved with the ability to see inside a body without opening it up. But those had been fantasies, wishes, the kind of impossible hopes you didn't speak aloud because they revealed how desperate things had actually become. Yet this American captain spoke of X-rays and surgical suites as if they were the minimum acceptable standard of care. Standing there in that impossibly clean barracks, surrounded by evidence of abundance that contradicted everything she'd been told about America's weakness and desperation, Greta felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. If the Americans had all this while supposedly losing the war, while suffering under blockades and struggling to maintain their society, what did that say about the information she'd received from her own government? What else had been a lie? The questions spiraled through her mind like water circling a drain, pulling her toward conclusions she wasn't ready to face. That first night, lying on sheets softer than any she'd slept on in years, staring up at electric lights that never wavered or failed, Greta couldn't sleep. Around her, the other women tossed and turned with their own demons, their own dawning realizations. Anna wept quietly into her pillow, muffling the sound but unable to stop the shaking of her shoulders. Liesel lay rigid and silent, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling as if she could find answers in the smooth plaster. None of them spoke about what they were feeling, but the silence was full of unasked questions and unwelcome truths. 3 weeks crawled past, each day bringing new evidence that everything they'd believed was built on foundations of sand. Greta found herself assigned to work in the camp's medical wing, expecting menial labour and close supervision. Instead, Dr. Mitchell handed her a stethoscope on her first morning and asked her professional opinion about a patient's respiratory symptoms. "You have medical training," he said simply, as if her nationality was irrelevant to her knowledge and skill. "We're short-handed and could use the help. Would you be willing to assist?" The question itself was radical. Not an order, not even a strong suggestion, but an actual request that implied she had the right to refuse. Greta nodded, not trusting her voice, and followed him into an examination room where an American soldier waited with obvious chest congestion. Dr. Mitchell introduced her as Nurse Greta from the prisoner staff, and the soldier just nodded politely, showing no fear or disgust at being treated by someone who'd been his enemy days earlier. She performed the examination, noting the symptoms and suggesting possible diagnoses, and Dr. Mitchell listened to her input as if it had value, incorporating her observations into his final assessment. Over the following days, she discovered that the medical wing's supplies were beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Entire shelves lined with antibiotics of various types, morphine for pain management that wasn't rationed by the dose, surgical instruments that gleamed under those ubiquitous electric lights, fresh bandages in quantities that seemed wasteful until she realized they were never reused. When she mentioned the abundance to Dr. Mitchell, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice, he shrugged with casual indifference. "We order what we need," he said, "and usually a bit more to be safe." It's important to have reserves for emergencies. Reserves. The word rattled around in Greta's mind for hours afterward. Her field unit hadn't had reserves of anything in months. They'd operated on hope and improvisation, stretching supplies until they literally fell apart, making impossible choices about who received treatment and who had to suffer without it. But here, Americans kept reserves, ordered more than they needed, treated supply management as a simple logistics problem rather than a daily crisis of conscience. She watched American medics treat a German prisoner's infected wound with the same care and attention they gave their own soldiers. Nobody questioned whether the supplies were worth using on an enemy. Nobody suggested that suffering might build character or serve some greater good. They just treated the infection efficiently and thoroughly, the way doctors should treat patients, as if the nationality of the person in pain was irrelevant to their obligation to heal. The simplicity of it was devastating. Captain Reynolds continued her campaign of small kindnesses that left the German prisoners increasingly bewildered and off balance. She personally ensured each woman received proper winter clothing, not thin, inadequate garments that met minimum standards, but actual wool coats thick enough to block the Louisiana chill. When Frau Weber complained of arthritis pain, Captain Reynolds arranged for heated compresses and aspirin twice daily, adjusting the schedule based on when the older woman's symptoms were worst. When young Klaus from Hamburg mentioned missing his mother's cooking, the captain somehow obtained ingredients and arranged kitchen time for him to make sauerbraten, filling the camp with smells that made grown men weep with homesickness. "It's manipulation," Liesel insisted during their evening conversations, though her voice had lost its earlier fire and certainty. "They're trying to make us soft, compliant, psychologically dependent on their approval. My father warned me about American tactics, about how they use comfort to break down resistance." She sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else, reciting lessons that no longer quite fit the evidence before her eyes. But even Liesel couldn't explain away what Greta discovered during her third week in the medical wing. An American nurse named Patricia had asked her to help with inventory, and as they counted supplies together, Patricia mentioned something that stopped Greta mid-count, pen frozen above her clipboard. "My shift ends in 20 minutes, Patricia said with obvious relief, glancing at the clock on the wall. "I'm looking forward to getting home to my apartment. My roommate and I are planning to catch a picture show tonight, and I need to figure out what to wear." "Your apartment?" Greta asked carefully, setting down her clipboard with deliberate precision. "You live off base? In your own place?" Patricia looked confused by the question, as if Greta had asked something obvious to the point of absurdity. "Yes, of course," she replied. "I rent a 2-bedroom with another nurse from the hospital in town. We split the cost and it works out well. Why do you ask?" The confusion in her voice was genuine, unmarked by any awareness that what she was describing might be unusual or noteworthy. Greta struggled to formulate her next question without revealing too much about how different things were back home. "You chose this work," she said slowly. "Nursing. Working here at this camp. You applied for the position?" Patricia's confusion deepened, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand why these questions needed asking. "Well, yes, I had to complete nursing school first and get my certification, but then I applied for several positions and accepted this one." She paused, genuine curiosity crossing her face. "I could leave if I wanted to, though I'd need to give proper notice." "How does it work in Germany? Are nursing assignments handled differently there?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a doused fire. Greta thought about her own assignment to medical service, how refusing would have meant disgrace for her family, possible arrest, certainly the end of any medical career or educational opportunity. She thought about the women in munitions factories, assigned their positions by party officials who decided what served the greater good. She thought about her sister's letter mentioning their neighbour being sent to an aircraft factory 3 cities away, separated from her young children for the duration, no choice offered or implied. She thought about the word service and how it had always carried the weight of obligation rather than opportunity. "We serve where we're most needed," Greta said finally, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "The state determines where our skills can best contribute to the common good." Patricia nodded slowly, and Greta could see her trying to process this information, fitting it into whatever understanding she had of how other countries operated. The American nurse didn't press further, which was a mercy Greta appreciated, because she wasn't sure she could explain without revealing how completely the comparison indicted everything she'd accepted as normal. That evening, during the designated exercise hour when prisoners could walk the camp perimeter, Greta found herself drawn to the fence line where Louisiana countryside stretched into the distance. The town of Ruston sparkled in the gathering dusk, electric lights beginning to appear like earthbound stars, so many of them that they seemed to form constellations across the landscape. Even here, in what should have been remote backwater territory, Americans had brought their impossible abundance of power and illumination. She tried to imagine Hamburg with this many working lights and failed utterly. Liesl stood nearby, alone as she often was these days, staring out at the same view with an expression Greta couldn't quite read. The younger woman had been quieter lately, her defensive certainty gradually eroding under the weight of accumulated evidence. They stood in silence for several minutes before Liesl spoke, her voice barely audible over the evening sounds of the camp settling into routine. "I received a letter today," she said without preamble or context. "From my friend Margot in Berlin." Greta waited, knowing better than to rush whatever confession was coming. In the distance, an American guard made his rounds, nodding respectfully to the German prisoners he passed, his posture relaxed rather than vigilant. From the medical wing, she could hear Dr. Mitchell's voice as he explained something to the night shift nurses, his tone patient and educational. "Margot says the Americans dropped leaflets before the last bombing raid," Liesl continued, still not looking at Greta. "Warnings, detailed maps showing exactly which neighborhoods would be targeted, telling people to evacuate." She finally turned, and her face showed confusion so deep it approached anguish. Why would they do that? Why warn their enemies before attacking them? The question echoed across the space between them, unanswerable and devastating. Greta had no response that wouldn't sound like either propaganda or heresy, so she said nothing, just stood there sharing the silence and the impossible view and the growing suspicion that mercy might be more powerful than cruelty could ever be. The mail call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in January, when the Louisiana air carried an unusual chill that made them all think of proper winters back home. Sergeant Kowalski's voice rang across the common area as she read names from a stack of letters that had taken weeks to cross the Atlantic, each envelope representing a connection to lives that felt increasingly distant and unreal. Greta's heart jumped when she heard her own name called, followed immediately by Liesl's. They hadn't received word from Germany in over a month, and the silence had been both a relief and a source of gnawing anxiety. Greta's letter came from her sister Marta in Hamburg, 3 pages of careful handwriting that she opened with trembling fingers, expecting news of resilience, of German strength, of the turning tide that propaganda broadcasts still promised despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Instead, she found a catalogue of despair so complete it made her stomach clench with physical pain. "The electricity has been out for 2 weeks now," Marta wrote, her handwriting smaller and more cramped than usual, as if she were trying to conserve paper. "We burn candles when we can find them, furniture when we cannot. The hospital where you worked closed last month, no supplies left, and most of the staff either dead or conscripted for other duties. Herr Kellner from the building next door died from a simple infection, the kind that penicillin would have cured easily, but there's been none available for civilians since autumn. The children in our building cry constantly from hunger, these thin wailing sounds that never stop. I've lost so much weight that Mother's old dresses hang on me like I'm a scarecrow. I barely recognize myself in mirrors." Greta looked up from the letter, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Above her, electric lights hummed their steady song. From the kitchen she could smell fresh bread baking. Through the window she could see American staff members discussing supply orders, debating whether they had enough medical equipment for the week ahead. The contrast felt obscene, wrong in ways that made her want to scream or laugh or both simultaneously. Across the room, Liesl had gone absolutely still over her own letter, her face draining of colour until she looked like a marble statue. Her hands shook so badly that the single sheet of paper rattled audibly, and her breathing had gone shallow and rapid in a way that made Greta concerned she might faint. She crossed the room quickly, sitting beside the younger woman and placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "What is it?" she asked gently, keeping her voice low. "What's happened?" Liesl's response came out as barely a whisper, each word forced through what sounded like a throat full of broken glass. "My neighbourhood in Berlin. Margot says the Americans bombed it last month. Heavy damage, lots of casualties." She paused, swallowing convulsively. They dropped leaflets 3 days before. Warnings, maps showing exactly which blocks would be hit. Most people evacuated in time. "That sounds like good news," Greta said carefully, though she could sense there was more coming, something that explained the devastation on Liesl's face. "They also dropped medical supplies afterward," Liesl continued, her voice cracking on the words. "Bandages, morphine, even food packets for the survivors. Margot says American medics came in under flags of truce and worked alongside our doctors in the rubble, treating anyone who needed help regardless of which side they were on." She looked up at Greta with eyes full of confusion and pain, and the beginning of something that might have been understanding. Why would they warn us and then help us? What kind of enemy does that? The question hung between them as other prisoners continued reading their own letters, processing their own revelations. Around the room, similar scenes were unfolding. Women reading about destroyed cities, dead relatives, desperate shortages, all while sitting in a place where abundance seemed as natural and unremarkable as breathing. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, forcing conclusions that nobody wanted to face. That evening, Captain Reynolds made an announcement that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She had arranged for them to have access to radio broadcasts from multiple sources, not just American news or Allied propaganda, but German broadcasts, British reports, even neutral Swiss coverage of the war's progress. The women could choose what they wanted to hear, when they wanted to hear it, without censorship or restriction. "Truth isn't something to be rationed or controlled," Captain Reynolds said simply, her tone matter-of-fact rather than grand. "You have the right to know what's happening in your homeland, to hear different perspectives and make your own judgments. We trust you to handle information like adults." The first broadcast they chose was from German radio, hoping desperately to hear familiar rhetoric that might restore some sense of reality and normality. Instead, they heard increasingly frantic promises about final victories and wonder weapons, assurances that sounded hollow and desperate against the backdrop of their current circumstances. The announcer described American cities in ruins while they sat surrounded by evidence of American prosperity. He spoke of German armies advancing victoriously while their letters described chaos and retreat and systematic collapse. When they switched to the BBC broadcast from London, the reports painted a different picture entirely, one of German cities under sustained bombardment, of supply lines severed beyond repair, of a regime fighting its last desperate battles while pretending strength it no longer possessed. The facts aligned uncomfortably well with what their letters from home described, with the evidence of their own senses. But it was the American broadcast that shattered something fundamental in Liesl's carefully constructed worldview. The reporter described American bomber crews who had requested permission to drop medical supplies over German civilian areas, pilots who had volunteered for dangerous mercy missions to deliver food to starving populations. He spoke of American field hospitals treating wounded German soldiers with the same care and resources given to Allied troops, of medics who saw suffering rather than nationality. "My father always said Americans were soft," Liesl said into the silence after the broadcast ended, her voice hollow and lost. He said their kindness was weakness, that they'd never have the strength to win a real war because they cared too much about enemy lives. She stared at the radio as if it might suddenly provide different answers, better answers, ones that didn't require her to question everything her father had taught her. But what if their kindness is their strength? What if we were wrong about everything? Nobody answered because there was no answer that didn't reshape the foundations of their understanding. That night, Greta lay on her clean sheets under electric lights that never flickered or failed, thinking about the letter still clutched in her hand. Marta had ended with a line that kept echoing in her mind, simple words that carried the weight of impossible dreams. "I dream of places with electric lights and hot food," her sister had written. "I dream of doctors who have enough medicine to heal everyone who needs it, of children who don't cry from hunger, of nights where we don't have to choose between warmth and food. Do such places really exist, or are they only in fairy tales that help us survive?" Greta looked around the barracks where German prisoners slept peacefully, their stomachs full, their medical needs met, their dignity intact despite being captured enemies. Such places did exist. She was living in one. The Americans had built them, maintained them, extended their benefits even to those who'd fought against them. But if this was possible, if abundance and mercy could coexist with strength and security, then everything she'd been told about necessary sacrifices and harsh realities might be lies as well. The thought terrified her more than any battlefield had, because it meant her suffering and her service and all those deaths might have been for nothing, for propaganda, for deceptions that served power rather than truth. The letter that broke Liesl arrived on a February morning when ice coated the windows and made walking treacherous across the compound. Sergeant Kowalski called her name with unusual gentleness, as if she somehow knew what the thin envelope contained, could sense disaster in the weight of paper and ink. Liesl accepted it with her usual careful composure, but Greta noticed her hands trembling as she broke the seal, noticed the way her breathing changed before she'd read even a single word. She read it once, her face cycling through confusion, then again with growing disbelief, and finally a third time with an expression of grief so profound it seemed to hollow her out from within. The letter fluttered from her fingers like a dying bird, drifting to the floor while she stood frozen in the middle of the common area, conversations continuing around her as if the world hadn't just ended. Greta retrieved the letter and read it quickly, the news brutal in its simplicity. Colonel Heinrich Weber, Liesl's father, had been executed as a traitor to the regime, not for opposing the leadership, not for sabotage or resistance, but for failing to act quickly enough against the July 20th conspirators who'd attempted to kill the man everyone called the Führer. He'd died defending the system that ultimately consumed him, shot by his own side for insufficient zealotry, for the crime of momentary hesitation in the face of a choice between loyalty and conscience. "Liesl," Greta said softly, reaching for the younger woman's arm, but she had already turned and walked away with mechanical precision, moving toward the barracks like an automaton whose programming had failed. What followed was a collapse so complete it frightened everyone who witnessed it. Liesl stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped acknowledging the world around her in any meaningful way. She lay on her cot staring at nothing, tears streaming silently down her face for hours at a time, her body present but her mind seemingly fled to some interior space where the betrayal couldn't reach. When Captain Reynolds tried to speak with her, Liesl turned toward the wall. When Dr. Mitchell suggested mild sedatives to help her sleep, she refused to open her mouth for the pills. She was drowning in front of them, and nobody seemed able to throw her anything substantial enough to grab onto. It was Captain Reynolds who finally broke through the silence, though not with words or comfort or any of the usual tools of consolation. She appeared in the barracks 3 days after the letter arrived, carrying a manila folder thick with documents, her expression grave and determined. Without asking permission or offering explanation, She sat on the edge of Liesel's cot and began laying out photographs and official reports in a systematic grid across the blanket. "These are from camps we've liberated in Poland and Germany," Captain Reynolds said quietly, her voice carrying across the barracks so that other women began to gather, drawn by the seriousness of her tone. "Your father's signature appears on some of the transfer orders, authorizing movements of prisoners. The photographs were worse than anything Greta had imagined propaganda could fabricate, worse than nightmares, worse than the darkest corners of human imagination. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, their eyes hollow with suffering beyond words, mass graves stretching into the distance. Medical experimentation rooms with equipment that made her stomach heave. Children's belongings piled like mountains of discarded humanity, shoes and dolls and eyeglasses in quantities that spoke of industrial-scale murder. And there, in careful German script on official letterhead bearing the Reich's symbols, was Colonel Heinrich Weber's signature. Not once, not twice, but dozens of times across different documents, authorizing transport of undesirable elements to work facilities, approving shipments of prisoners to locations that the documents now revealed were extermination camps. His handwriting neat and precise, the same loops and angles Liesel would have seen on birthday cards and school permission slips. "No," Liesel whispered, sitting up abruptly and grabbing one of the documents with shaking hands. She traced her father's signature with trembling fingers. He wouldn't have known. They told us these were resettlement programs, work camps where people were being helped to find new opportunities. He was following orders to help people. Captain Reynolds handed her another document, this one a detailed report from a camp commandant describing methods of execution and body disposal, efficiency metrics and quotas. At the bottom, a note in Weber's handwriting that made Greta's blood run cold. Approved for implementation. Recommend increased efficiency as discussed. Liesel's composure shattered like glass under a hammer. She doubled over as if physically struck, great heaving sobs tearing through her body, sounds of anguish so raw they seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. All the idealism, all the pride in her father's service, all the certainty about German righteousness and moral superiority, everything she'd built her identity around for 20 years, crumbled into ash and dust. 20 years he told me we were saving Germany, she gasped between sobs that shook her entire frame. 20 years of speeches about making the nation pure and strong, about sacrifices for the greater good, about the necessity of harsh measures for future prosperity. And all this time, we were doing this. Her voice rose to a wail. We were murdering children and calling it policy. Greta sat beside her and pulled her close, feeling the smaller woman's whole body shake with grief and horror and the terrible weight of complicity. There were no words for this kind of betrayal, no comfort that could bridge the gap between the father Liesel had loved and the man whose signature had sent thousands to their deaths. The silence in the barracks was absolute, every woman there confronting her own role in a machine that had produced such systematic evil. "I helped them," Liesel whispered into Greta's shoulder, her voice small and broken. "All those rallies I attended, all those speeches I applauded, every time I turned away when neighbours disappeared, every time I repeated what they told me about inferior races and necessary measures. I helped them do this. I'm complicit in all of it." The weight of that realization settled over the barracks like a suffocating blanket. Other German prisoners had gathered to listen, to see the photographs, to read the documents, and their faces reflected the same terrible recognition. They had all been part of something monstrous, even those who hadn't known the full scope, even those who'd convinced themselves they were serving something noble. Ignorance wasn't innocence, not when the signs had been there for anyone willing to look. For 3 days, Liesel refused to leave her bunk, turning away food and water and even Dr. Mitchell's gentle attempts at medical intervention. Greta began to fear they might lose her entirely, that the shock of truth might prove more destructive than any battlefield wound, that sometimes knowing was worse than dying ignorant. But on the 4th day, something unexpected happened that pulled Liesel back from the edge of that abyss. Anna Richter went into premature labour. The camp hospital sprang into coordinated action, Dr. Mitchell barking orders while American nurses worked seamlessly alongside German women who'd been trained in medical care. They needed every pair of skilled hands, and nobody questioned nationality or status when a life hung in the balance. Greta found herself assisting with the delivery, her training taking over as she focused on the immediate crisis of a baby coming too early and a mother struggling through complications. She was monitoring Anna's vital signs when she noticed Liesl standing in the doorway of the medical wing, still pale and hollow-eyed, but somehow present again, drawn by the sounds of crisis and the fundamental human need to help when help is needed. Without being asked, without anyone directing her, Liesl stepped forward and took Anna's hand, murmuring words of encouragement in soft German, her voice still rough from days of crying but steady enough to provide comfort. When the baby finally emerged after hours of difficult labour, a tiny, perfect girl with powerful lungs that announced her arrival to the entire camp, Liesl was the first to hold her after the medical team finished their initial examinations. She stood there cradling new life while surrounded by American and German hands that had worked together to preserve it, and something shifted in her devastated expression, some small spark of possibility emerging from the ruins. "She doesn't know," Liesl whispered, looking down at the baby's scrunched face with something approaching wonder. "She doesn't know about any of it. The camps, the lies, what we did, what we allowed to happen. She's just innocent, just possibility." Captain Reynolds appeared beside them, her voice gentle but firm. "That's where we start rebuilding," she said. "With innocence, with choosing what we build next instead of defending what came before. With deciding that the future doesn't have to repeat the past." Liesl looked up at her with eyes that had aged decades in a matter of days, her face showing a weariness that went bone deep. "How do we build anything good from foundations this rotten?" she asked, her voice raw. "How do we move forward knowing what we know?" "The same way anyone builds anything worthwhile," Captain Reynolds replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than philosophical. "One honest choice at a time, one act of mercy that refuses to replicate cruelty, one decision to choose truth over comfortable lies. It doesn't erase what happened, but it determines what happens next." The news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Ruston on a humid May afternoon when the Louisiana air hung thick with the promise of summer storms. Captain Reynolds gathered all the prisoners in the common area and announced it simply, without triumph or mockery or any attempt to gloat over defeated enemies. The war was over. The regime had fallen. Arrangements for repatriation would begin within weeks for those who wished to return home. The silence that followed felt heavier than any celebration could have been. These women had spent months watching their entire worldview collapse piece by piece, but hearing it declared finished, hearing that everything they'd once served no longer existed in any meaningful form, brought a grief that surprised them all with its intensity. Even knowing what they now knew about the camps and the lies and the systematic cruelty, there was still mourning for the country they'd thought they were serving, for the ideals they'd believed in before learning they were facades covering horror. Greta found herself crying for reasons she couldn't fully articulate or separate into distinct emotions. Relief that the killing was over, certainly. Grief for all the lives lost to serve lies and power rather than truth or justice. Shame for her own complicity, however unknowing. But also a strange, painful hope that maybe, something better could be built from these ruins. That version of herself who'd believed in duty and honour, who'd thought medical service meant serving something noble, felt as dead as the regime itself, and she wasn't sure who she would become in the wake of such complete transformation. "What's left for us?" Anna asked during the long evening that followed. Little Giselle sleeping peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the weight of history her mother carried. "The Germany we return to isn't the Germany we left. It's broken and occupied and full of people who don't know yet what we've learned." It was Liesl who answered, her voice still fragile but carrying new determination born from having already lost everything and survived the fall. Then we make it something different, she said. Something better than what came before. We tell the truth even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. We build institutions that serve people rather than power. We choose mercy over revenge, transparency over propaganda, human dignity over ideology. Or we try, at least. We have to try. Over the following days, as the reality of return settled over them like morning fog, the women began making choices that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Some, like Anna, planned to return to their hometowns and rebuild what they could from literal and metaphorical ashes. Others spoke of staying in America, of starting entirely new lives in a country that had shown them mercy when it could have chosen revenge, that had demonstrated what abundance and compassion could look like when paired with strength. But it was Captain Reynolds who provided the framework that would guide Greta's final decision. She appeared in the medical wing one afternoon, carrying a leather satchel and wearing an expression of carefully controlled emotion that suggested whatever she was about to say mattered deeply. "My brother wrote me a letter before he died at Normandy," she said without preamble, her voice steady but soft. He described German medics who helped wounded Americans during a temporary ceasefire, soldiers who could have remained enemy combatants but chose to be healers instead. She opened the satchel and pulled out a stack of medical journals, American publications on surgical techniques, pharmaceutical advances, hospital administration, the accumulated knowledge of a medical system that hadn't been destroyed by total war. "He said those moments taught him something important," Captain Reynolds continued, placing the journals on the examination table between them. "That people are complicated and contradictory, capable of both cruelty and mercy sometimes within the same hour. But kindness is simple, and it compounds. Countries are just stories we tell ourselves, narratives we maintain until we can't anymore. But mercy is real and concrete, and it saves lives." She tapped the stack of journals with one finger. "These are for you. Documentation of everything you've learned here, plus techniques we've developed during the war. Not as propaganda or proof of American superiority, but as evidence that former enemies can choose to heal instead of harm. You can take this knowledge back to Germany and use it to rebuild medical systems that serve everyone, not just party members or preferred populations." Greta touched the cover of the top journal with trembling fingers, emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Inside were detailed surgical procedures, photographs of advanced medical equipment, research findings that could save countless lives if properly applied. Someone believed she could be trusted with this knowledge, believed she would use it to build something good from the ruins of everything she'd once believed in. The repatriation ship was scheduled to leave from New Orleans in 2 weeks. As that date approached, the camp took on a bittersweet atmosphere of endings and beginnings, of closure and transformation. Liesel had made her choice after long nights of soul-searching. She would stay in America and train as a nurse, using her experience with trauma and transformation to help other refugees adapt to their new lives, to build something constructive from her intimate understanding of how propaganda and ideology could destroy from within. Anna would return to Bavaria with little Giselle, determined to rebuild her family's small medical practice and provide care to a community that would desperately need healing in every sense of the word. And Greta would return to Hamburg carrying a suitcase full of medical journals and a letter of recommendation from Captain Reynolds that would open doors she'd never imagined possible, that might help her transform the knowledge she'd gained into systems that served human need rather than political expediency. The night before departure, Captain Reynolds presented each of the departing women with a small American flag, not as a symbol of conquest or forced allegiance, but as a reminder of what they'd discovered about the possibility of choosing mercy over revenge, abundance over scarcity, hope over hatred. "This isn't about becoming American," she explained carefully, making sure each woman understood the distinction. "It's about carrying forward what we've learned together about treating former enemies like future family, about building systems that serve humanity rather than ideology." Standing on the deck of the repatriation ship as it pulled away from New Orleans harbor, Greta watched the electric lights of the city stretch endlessly into the distance, just as they had on that first impossible night at Camp Ruston when she'd stepped off a train expecting deprivation and found abundance. But now she understood what those lights represented beyond simple prosperity. They were proof that human beings could choose to illuminate the darkness instead of contributing to it, could build systems that distributed resources rather than hoarding them, could extend mercy even to those who'd been enemies. In her suitcase lay medical journals that would help rebuild Hamburg's shattered hospitals. In her pocket was a letter of recommendation that would open doors to international medical collaboration. But in her heart she carried something more valuable than either document could represent. The knowledge that enemies could become healers, that mercy was a form of strength rather than weakness, that even from the ashes of the worst human cruelty imaginable, people could choose to build something beautiful if they had the courage to face truth and the determination to try. The lights of America faded behind them as the ship cut through dark Atlantic waters, but Greta stood at the rail long after the last glow disappeared below the horizon, whispering into the wind, carrying them toward a shattered homeland that would need everything she'd learned. "Now I know what's possible," she said to the darkness and the stars and the future waiting on the other side of the ocean. "Now I know what we could build if we choose truth over lies, mercy over cruelty, hope over despair. The question isn't whether such places can exist. The question is whether we'll have the courage to create them."